Hey guys, tonight we're taking a truly heartbreaking journey back to the very heart of medieval Europe, a world of towering castles and devout faith, but also a period where the most fundamental act of life was fraught with unimaginable peril. We're pulling back the rough linen curtain to uncover the awful and dangerous reality of childbirth for a medieval woman. Forget modern hospitals, pain medication, or sterile environments. You're about to discover a grim reality where every pregnancy was a high-stakes gamble, every labor a life-threatening ordeal, and where death often lurked in the shadows of the birthing room. This wasn't a serene process. It was a brutal, visceral struggle, profoundly physical and terrifyingly uncertain. Frankly, you probably wouldn't survive your first pregnancy without longing for a swift, painless disappearance. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Tell me, where in the world are you tuning in from? And what time is it for you right now? Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself suddenly standing in a small, humble cottage, or perhaps a slightly larger manor house, somewhere in medieval England or France, around the 13th or 14th century. The air is thick with the smell of damp earth, wood smoke, and a pervasive undercurrent of anxiety that you can almost taste. You are a medieval woman, perhaps a peasant wife, or a lady of a minor noble household. Your life has been one of hard work, fulfilling domestic duties, and perhaps, for some, navigating the complexities of an arranged marriage. But now, your body is changing. Your belly swells with new life, and with it comes a profound mix of hope, dread, and pervasive superstition. This is the pregnant pause, where the early signs of life trigger an immense wave of anticipation and terrifying uncertainty. Pregnancy in the Middle Ages was not openly discussed in polite society as it is today. It was a private matter, often concealed for as long as possible, particularly in its early stages. Once your pregnancy became undeniable, a quiet, almost palpable sense of anxiety would settle over your household, while the prospect of a new child, especially a son who would carry on the family name in labor, would bring immense joy and hope. The reality of childbirth was universally acknowledged as one of the most dangerous and terrifying experiences a medieval woman could face. It was literally a matter of life or death, a gamble with your very existence. It truly sucked to be pregnant in medieval times. The mortality rates for both mothers and infants were astronomically high, while precise statistics are hard to come by for the entire medieval period. Historians estimate that anywhere from 10% to 30% of women died during childbirth or in the immediate puerperal period, the weeks following birth, often due to infection or hemorrhage. For infants, the survival rates were even grimmer, with estimates suggesting that 25% to 50% of children would not survive their first year of life, and many more would not reach adulthood. These were not just numbers. These were the grim realities that every pregnant woman, every family, faced. You would likely know numerous women in your village or social circle who had died in childbirth or whose infants had succumbed to illness. The fear was personal, visceral, and omnipresent. This pervasive fear fueled a vast array of superstitions and folk beliefs surrounding pregnancy and childbirth, as people desperately sought any means to influence an outcome that felt entirely beyond their control. You might engage in various rituals, wear specific amulets or charms, or utter ancient prayers, hoping to ensure a safe delivery for yourself and a healthy birth for your child. These practices, while offering psychological comfort, underscored the profound helplessness people felt in the face of such a terrifying natural process. Common superstitions included protective charms, wearing specific herbs like vervain or hyssop, carrying relics of saints, or wearing inscribed amulets believed to ward off evil spirits or ease labor pains. You might be given a piece of parchment with a magic charm to hold during labor. Astrological beliefs, consulting astrologers if affordable to determine auspicious dates for conception or birth, believing the stars influence the child's destiny and the mother's safety. Symbolic actions, performing specific actions believed to influence labor, such as untying all knots in the house to ensure an untied birth, or avoiding certain foods. Prayers to saints, seeking intercession from specific saints associated with childbirth, such as Saint Margaret, patron saint of childbirth, or the Virgin Mary. You would pray fervently, seeking divine favor and protection, desperately hoping for a miracle. The lack of understanding of basic anatomy, physiology, and hygiene was a primary factor contributing to the high mortality rates. Medieval people had no concept of germ theory, no knowledge of sterile environments, and a very limited understanding of the complex biological processes of pregnancy and labor. This meant that every birth, however natural, carried immense, unseen risks that were entirely beyond the control of the mother or her attendants. For you, the pregnant woman, every ache, every new sensation, every period of discomfort would be scrutinized with a mixture of hope and profound anxiety. Was this a normal pregnancy symptom or a sign of trouble? Was the child growing well, or was there an unseen complication that would lead to miscarriage or a difficult birth? The lack of prenatal care, of regular checkups, meant you would live in perpetual uncertainty, relying solely on your own body signals and the wisdom or lack thereof of older women in your community. The role of the church in this context was immense. While childbirth was seen as a natural process, it was also inextricably linked to the biblical curse on Eve, Genesis 3:16. In pain you shall bring forth children, implying that suffering in labor was a divine punishment for original sin. This theological perspective, while sometimes offering spiritual solace, also reinforced the idea of inevitable agony and potential death as a righteous consequence. Adding a layer of spiritual fatalism to your experience, it really sucked to literally have the Bible condemn you to agony. The social pressure to produce heirs, particularly sons, was immense. For noble families, a son secured the lineage and inherited the estate. For peasant families, a son meant more hands for labor, ensuring the family's survival. This pressure meant that women were often expected to have numerous pregnancies throughout their fertile years, further increasing their cumulative risk of death from childbirth-related complications. The concept of family planning, or limiting pregnancies, was virtually non-existent. Driven by necessity and societal expectations, your body was a vessel for lineage, not entirely your own. One common misconception is that medieval women were simply more hardy or resilient to childbirth than modern women. While they certainly endured immense pain and hardship, their bodies were not biologically different. The high mortality rates were due to the systemic lack of medical knowledge, unsanitary conditions, and the absence of life-saving interventions that we take for granted today. Their resilience was born of necessity, not inherent biological superiority. Historians still meticulously study medieval medical texts like Trotula's treatises on women's medicine, court records detailing births and deaths, and osteoarchaeological evidence from female skeletal remains which often show signs of multiple pregnancies, birth trauma, and related infections to understand the precise maternal and infant mortality rates and the specific complications that plagued childbirth in the Middle Ages. Furthermore, the lack of privacy surrounding pregnancy and impending childbirth was immense. Your swelling belly would be a public declaration, and your condition would be a matter of communal interest and discussion. As labor approached, the entire female community, midwives, neighbors, family members would gather, observing your every contraction, offering advice, and waiting for the outcome. This lack of personal space, even in your most vulnerable moments, added another layer of emotional discomfort to the physical ordeal. The economic implications of pregnancy and childbirth were also significant. For peasant families, a woman's inability to labor in the fields during late pregnancy and the postpartum period meant lost income, adding strain to an already precarious livelihood. The cost of a midwife, if one could be afforded, or the expenses for funeral rites if the mother or child died, further burdened the struggling family. Your personal pain had direct economic consequences. So your medieval pregnancy began with the pregnant pause, a chilling mix of hope and profound dread. Surrounded by pervasive superstitions, the astronomical mortality rates for both mothers and infants, coupled with a fundamental lack of medical understanding, transformed this natural process into a terrifying gamble with your life, making the awful and dangerous reality of childbirth for a medieval woman a constant. Agonizing preoccupation from the moment you conceived, having conceived and entered the terrifying pregnant pause. Your journey through medieval childbirth inevitably led you to the heart of the ordeal, the birthing room itself. Forget sterile environments, privacy, or modern comfort. Childbirth for a medieval woman took place in a setting defined by filth, darkness, and pervasive fear, making it profoundly awful and dangerous. Imagine your designated birthing space. For most peasant women, this would be your own humble cottage or a small, cramped room within it. For a noble woman, it might be a chamber within a manor house or a castle, regardless of social status. The emphasis was not on cleanliness or modern medical hygiene. The room would likely be dimly lit, perhaps by a small, flickering oil lamp or a few beeswax candles, casting dancing shadows that amplified the sense of foreboding. Natural light would be minimal, and windows often kept shuttered, partly for warmth, partly for privacy such as it was, and partly due to superstitious beliefs about air or evil spirits. This pervasive gloom, combined with the escalating pain, would create an atmosphere of profound claustrophobia and anxiety. It truly sucked to give birth in the dark. Sanitation was rudimentary at best, and often non-existent. There was no concept of germ theory. Midwives in attendance would have no understanding that invisible microorganisms could cause deadly infections. The birthing room, whether a peasant's dirt-floored hut or a castle chamber, would be far from sterile. Uncleanliness floors would be unswept, often made of packed earth or rough stone. Bedding, if available, would be simple straw mattresses or rough linens, rarely changed or thoroughly cleaned between births. Contaminated water, water used for washing hands or for cleansing the mother, would be drawn from communal wells or rivers that were often contaminated by human and animal waste. This water, used without boiling or sterilization, would be a direct vector for deadly pathogens. Unwashed hands, the hands of the midwife and any assisting women, while perhaps rinsed, would not be scrubbed clean with antiseptic soaps. They would inevitably carry bacteria from previous patients, from everyday life, or from the unsanitary environment directly to the most vulnerable areas of your body, creating a high risk of infection. Bodily fluids. Childbirth is a messy process. Blood, amniotic fluid, and other bodily excretions would inevitably accumulate, creating a fertile breeding ground for bacteria. Without proper disposal or cleaning, these fluids would further contaminate the birthing environment. Imagine lying in a pool of fluids, knowing your life might depend on cleanliness you couldn't achieve. It really sucked to give birth in a cesspool. The atmosphere would be filled with the sounds of your escalating labor pains. Childbirth was universally agonizing, and there was no effective pain medication beyond perhaps some strong ale, wine, or rudimentary herbal concoctions like poppy juice or mandrake, which were unreliable and often dangerous. Your screams, your groans, and your desperate cries would fill the small room, a primal symphony of suffering. The other women present your mother, sisters, female neighbors, or perhaps servants would offer words of encouragement, prayers, or folk remedies. But their ability to truly alleviate your agony would be minimal. Your posture during labor would vary, but standing or kneeling was common. Often supported by a midwife or a birthing stool, a low, three-legged stool with an open front. This posture was thought to utilize gravity, but it was physically demanding and could exacerbate other complications. Imagine pushing with all your might, your body racked with contractions, while trying to maintain an awkward, upright position for hours on end. The birthing room would be exclusively populated by women. Men, including your husband, were typically excluded from the birthing chamber, as childbirth was considered a uniquely female domain, steeped in traditional female knowledge and rituals. The midwife, usually an older, experienced woman from the community, would be the central figure, surrounded by female relatives and neighbors who acted as assistants and emotional support. This created a powerful, communal, but often grim, atmosphere of shared female experience, knowledge, and collective fear. The role of superstition and religious ritual was prominent. The birthing room might be adorned with religious icons, blessed candles, or protective charms. Prayers to saints like Saint Margaret, patron saint of childbirth, or the Virgin Mary would be constantly uttered. Seeking divine intervention for a safe delivery, the midwife might employ various folk remedies or ritualistic practices believed to ward off evil spirits, ensure an easy birth, or protect the mother and child. These rituals, while offering psychological comfort, underscored the profound helplessness everyone felt in the face of such a terrifying, unpredictable event. One common misconception is that all medieval childbirth occurred in isolation. In reality, for most women, childbirth was a communal event attended by a midwife and a gathering of female relatives and neighbors. This communal support network, rooted in generations of shared experience, provided practical assistance, emotional comfort, and a crucial transfer of traditional knowledge about birthing practices. The exclusion of men and the focus on female community made the birthing room a uniquely gendered space. Historians still meticulously study medieval medical texts like those attributed to Trotula from Salerno, detailing women's medicine, illuminated manuscripts depicting birth scenes, and later ecclesiastical records to understand the precise customs, attendance, and social dynamics of medieval childbirth, consistently revealing its communal and female-centric nature. Furthermore, the duration of labor was immensely unpredictable and often agonizingly long. Without modern interventions like Pitocin or C-sections, difficult or prolonged labors could stretch for many hours, even days, pushing your body and mind to the absolute limits of human endurance. Every contraction would bring renewed pain, every hour a mounting sense of desperation. The physical exhaustion alone could be fatal, weakening you to the point where your body simply gave up, leaving you vulnerable to complications. The constant sounds of your own suffering, coupled with the hushed whispers and anxious prayers of the women around you, would create a profound psychological pressure. You would be aware of their hope, their fear, and their expectations, intensifying your own struggle. The knowledge that both your life and your child's life hung precariously in the balance, without any guaranteed positive outcome, would be a constant, terrifying burden. Your physical agony was intertwined with profound mental anguish, transforming the birthing room into a crucible of both body and soul. The sheer unpredictability of outcomes was terrifying. A birth that seemed to be progressing normally could suddenly turn catastrophic due to unforeseen complications. The lack of understanding about fetal position, placental issues, or maternal health problems meant that a perfectly healthy woman could suddenly face a life-threatening crisis in a matter of minutes. With no effective means of intervention, this inherent uncertainty made every birth a profound gamble, even for those who had survived previous ones. So, your medieval childbirth began in the birthing room, a setting defined by pervasive filth, suffocating darkness, and palpable fear, the unsanitary conditions, the absence of pain relief, the intense physical agony of prolonged labor, and the ever-present threat of unseen complications, all conspired to make this fundamental act of life profoundly awful and dangerous. Your grim reality was a testament to the brutal, visceral, and terrifying struggle that every medieval woman faced in bringing new life into a world that offered little mercy. Having entered the terrifying birthing room, your fate in medieval childbirth now rested almost entirely on the hands of one crucial figure, the midwife. Forget trained medical doctors with advanced degrees. Your primary birth attendant operated with a blend of inherited skill, pervasive folklore, and grim limitations, making her care, however well-intentioned, profoundly awful and dangerous. Imagine the midwife, often called a wise woman or sage femme, entering your birthing room. She was typically an older woman from your community, often a neighbor or a family friend, who had extensive practical experience gleaned from attending countless births throughout her life. Her knowledge was passed down through generations, learned through observation, trial, and agonizing error, rather than formal medical schooling, which was largely non-existent for women in medieval Europe and often prohibited by institutions controlled by male physicians. She would be the most experienced person in the room, commanding respect and trust from the assembled women. It truly sucked to have your doctor be someone's grandma. The midwife's skills were often considerable for her time. She understood the basic mechanics of birth, how to recognize the stages of labor, and how to position the mother to aid delivery, often encouraging upright or squatting positions. Using a birthing stool, she would monitor your contractions, encourage your pushing, and provide emotional support. She might possess a practical knowledge of herbal remedies to ease pain, though none truly effective by modern standards, or to encourage contractions. For example, herbs like pennyroyal or savin were sometimes used, though these could also be dangerous. She might offer prayers, recite charms, or employ various folk rituals believed to ensure a safe delivery. Her presence, her calm demeanor, and her experience were often the greatest comforts you would receive. However, the midwife's care, despite her dedication, was fraught with severe and horrifying limitations, rooted in the complete absence of modern medical understanding. No understanding of germ theory. This was perhaps the most fatal limitation. The midwife, like everyone else, had no concept that invisible bacteria caused infection. Her hands, while perhaps rinsed, would not be sterilized. Tools, if used like a basic knife for the umbilical cord, would be unsterilized. The birthing room itself, as discussed in Chapter 2, was unsanitary. Every touch, every intervention carried an immense, unseen risk of introducing deadly pathogens directly into your open womb, leading to fatal puerperal fever. Imagine her kind, experienced hands, unknowingly bringing you death. It truly sucked to be killed by unseen microbes. Lack of surgical intervention. The midwife had no ability to perform complex surgical procedures like a cesarean, section C-section to save a mother or child in a difficult labor. Such interventions were virtually unknown or, if attempted, almost universally fatal for the mother due to hemorrhage and infection, if the baby was malpositioned, or if labor was prolonged and obstructed. Her options were extremely limited. She might try manual manipulation, often agonizingly painful and dangerous, or resort to crude instruments like hooks or knives, if desperate to dismember the fetus to save the mother's life. A last resort of unimaginable horror. No pain, medication beyond rudimentary herbal sedatives that were often ineffective or dangerous. There was no true pain relief. You would endure the agony of labor unmedicated, your screams filling the room, your body racked by contractions. The midwife could offer only encouragement and a strong hand to brace against limited knowledge of complications while experienced in normal births. A midwife had limited understanding of complex complications like placenta previa, where the placenta blocks the cervix, preeclampsia, or severe postpartum hemorrhage. Her remedies for such conditions would be ineffective, leaving you vulnerable to rapid, fatal outcomes. The stakes were immense in a difficult labor, when hours stretched into days and the mother's strength waned. The midwife faced agonizing decisions. She would be under immense pressure from the family and community to save both mother and child. Her reputation, and even her future livelihood depended on a successful outcome. This pressure, combined with her limited tools and knowledge, made every difficult birth a desperate, high-stakes battle against death. The use of superstitious and religious rituals by the midwife was also common. Reflecting the pervasive beliefs of the age, she might hang specific charms around the birthing room, recite prayers to saints, or perform various symbolic actions believed to ease labor pains or ward off evil spirits. These rituals, while offering psychological comfort to the terrified mother and family, were no substitute for effective medical intervention when true complications arose, underscoring the profound helplessness of everyone involved. It really sucked to rely on magic for your health. One common misconception is that medieval midwives were always uneducated and relied purely on superstition, while lacking formal medical training and scientific understanding. Many midwives were highly skilled and practical, possessing vast empirical knowledge about normal childbirth. They were often experts in women's health within their communities, providing pre- and postnatal care, herbal remedies, and advice on family planning, though the latter was often frowned upon by the church. Their limitations stemmed from the lack of scientific knowledge and medical technology, not necessarily a complete absence of skill or dedication. Historians still meticulously study medieval midwifery manuals like the Book of Trotula, which was translated and widely used, legal records concerning midwives' Isao G, licensing or accusations of malpractice, and archaeological findings of birthing tools to understand the precise capabilities and respected, yet perilous, roles of medieval midwives, confirming their central but dangerous position in childbirth. Furthermore, the midwife's social standing could be precarious. While respected for her essential skills, she was also often blamed for bad outcomes, stillbirths, maternal deaths, especially if the family was wealthy or influential. Accusations of witchcraft or incompetence could arise. turning a tragic medical event into a legal or social nightmare for the midwife, adding a layer of personal risk to her already demanding profession. This vulnerability added a unique ethical dimension to her practice, where every unfavorable outcome could threaten her livelihood and reputation. The emotional burden on the midwife would be immense. She would constantly witness profound suffering, heartbreaking stillbirths, and agonizing maternal deaths, often powerless to intervene effectively. She would carry the grief of her community and the unspoken guilt of failures, even when they were beyond her control. This continuous exposure to extreme trauma and the limitations of her own knowledge would lead to profound emotional distress, perhaps leading to desensitization or a deep sense of compassion fatigue. Her professional life was a continuous confrontation with death, making her healing efforts often a source of profound personal sorrow. The risk of disease transmission for the midwife herself was also very high. By constantly attending births in unsanitary environments, her hands coming into contact with blood and bodily fluids, she was perpetually exposed to contagious diseases. She could easily contract puerperal fever from infected mothers or other infectious diseases, making her a vector for contagion between households, or simply succumbing to the very ailments she tried to alleviate. Her dedication, however noble, came with a grim occupational hazard. So, your experience of a medieval childbirth was profoundly awful and dangerous because your fate largely rested on the midwife's skill, folklore, and grim limits. Her practical experience was invaluable, but her complete lack of understanding of germ theory, her inability to perform surgical interventions, and the absence of effective pain medication or treatments for severe complications transformed every birth into a terrifying gamble. This pervasive reality of primitive medical care, even in the most intimate moments of life, was a defining, profoundly miserable aspect of childbirth for a medieval woman, having placed your trust in the skilled, yet limited, hands of the midwife. Your medieval childbirth now brought you to the heart of its most terrifying reality, the labor itself. Forget controlled breathing and epidurals. You faced hours, often days, of agonizing, relentless pain, punctuated by the constant threat of deadly complications that pushed your body to its absolute breaking point, making the act of bringing life into the world profoundly awful and dangerous. Imagine the onset of true labor. The first contractions, perhaps mild at first, would steadily intensify, growing into immense, overwhelming waves of pain that gripped your entire body. These were not the manageable pains of modern childbirth. There was no effective pain medication beyond perhaps a strong dose of wine, some rudimentary herbal sedatives like poppy juice or mandrake, which were unreliable and often dangerous due to their unpredictable effects on both mother and child, or simply a piece of cloth to bite down on. You would endure the agony unmedicated, your screams, your groans, and your desperate cries filling the small, dimly lit birthing room, a primal symphony of suffering. Your body would be racked with relentless contractions, pushing you to the limits of human endurance, with every nerve screaming in protest. It truly sucked to literally scream your way through childbirth. The duration of labor was immensely unpredictable and often agonizingly long. Without modern medical interventions like oxytocin to induce or strengthen contractions, or the option of a cesarean section, difficult or prolonged labors could stretch for many hours, sometimes even days. Imagine pushing with all your might, your body exhausted, your muscles screaming, your spirit waning, as hours bled into a terrifying eternity, with no end in sight. Prolonged labor dramatically increased the risk of both maternal and infant mortality, as it physically exhausted the mother and put immense stress on the baby. The physical and mental exhaustion alone could be fatal, weakening you to the point where your body simply gave up, leaving you vulnerable to severe complications. It really sucked to be in labor for days. The dangers of medieval labor were manifold, with numerous life-threatening complications that you and your midwife had no effective means to diagnose or treat. Obstructed labor. This was one of the most terrifying and common complications if the baby was too large, or if its position was abnormal due breech presentation, where the feet or buttocks come first, or transverse lie, where the baby lies sideways. Labor could become obstructed. The baby would be unable to pass through the birth canal despite relentless contractions. For the midwife, her options were extremely limited. She might attempt manual manipulation, agonizingly trying to reposition the baby within the womb, a process that was often excruciatingly painful for you and carried a high risk of internal injury to both mother and child. In desperate cases, if the baby was already dead, or if the mother's life was in immediate peril, some midwives might resort to crude instruments like hooks or knives if they possessed them and dared to dismember the fetus in utero to save the mother's life. A horrific last resort of unimaginable barbarity. Such a procedure was almost universally fatal for the infant and carried immense risks of infection and hemorrhage for the mother. It truly sucked to have your baby removed in pieces. Placenta previa or abruptio placenta. These are conditions where the placenta either covers the cervix or separates prematurely from the uterine wall. Both cause severe, life-threatening hemorrhage, excessive bleeding, which was a leading cause of maternal mortality, as we'll discuss more in Chapter 5. The midwife would have no way to diagnose these conditions, and her ability to stop profuse bleeding was almost non-existent. Eclampsia, pre-eclampsia, conditions causing high blood pressure, swelling, and seizures, often leading to coma and death, undiagnosed and untreated. These would be fatal to both mother and child. Uterine rupture prolonged, obstructed labor, particularly with forceful contractions, could lead to a rupture of the uterus, causing massive internal bleeding and almost instant death for the mother. Your posture during labor varied, but standing or kneeling was common, often supported by a midwife or a birthing stool, a low, three-legged stool with an open front. This upright posture was thought to utilize gravity and widen the birth canal, but it was physically demanding and could exacerbate exhaustion. Imagine pushing with all your might, your body racked with contractions, while trying to maintain an awkward, upright position for hours on end, without the benefit of a modern, adjustable hospital bed. The lack of understanding of basic anatomy and physiology beyond rudimentary observation severely limited the midwife's ability to intervene effectively when complications arose. They couldn't diagnose internal problems, nor could they safely perform surgical procedures. Their knowledge was based on generations of empirical observation of normal births, and deviations from that norm often spelled disaster. This profound medical impotence meant that for many complex labors, the midwife was little more than a grim spectator, able to offer comfort but not true medical aid. The emotional and psychological pressure on you, the mother, would be immense. You would be aware of the mounting anxiety in the room, the hushed whispers among the women if labor was prolonged, and the frantic prayers, the knowledge that both your life and your child's life hung precariously in the balance, without any guaranteed positive outcome, would be a constant, terrifying burden. Your physical agony was intertwined with profound mental anguish, transforming the birthing room into a crucible of both body and soul, where hope and despair wrestled for dominance. The very air in the birthing room would be thick with the smells of sweat, blood, and fear, often mixed with the acrid scent of unwashed linens and primitive poultices. This pervasive lack of hygiene, particularly concerning unsterilized hands and tools, meant that every stage of labor, every touch, every tear, was a potential gateway for deadly infection. The silent killer that claimed countless lives in the immediate postpartum period, which we'll discuss in Chapter 6, your immense efforts, your searing pain, could paradoxically lead directly to a fatal internal infection. One common misconception is that all medieval mothers simply pushed through labor with stoicism and natural ease. In reality, while medieval women were undoubtedly resilient and strong, childbirth was almost universally viewed as a dangerous and agonizing ordeal, a moment of profound peril for both mother and child. The suffering was immense, and the high mortality rates reflect that reality. The very concept of lying in the period of confinement and rest after childbirth, and the numerous prayers and rituals surrounding birth, underscore the societal recognition of its inherent dangers. Historians still meticulously study medieval medical texts like those attributed to Trotula from Salerno, detailing women's medicine, or various midwifery manuals, illuminated manuscripts depicting birth scenes, and later ecclesiastical records which sometimes include death rates to understand the precise customs, pain management or lack thereof, and the devastating challenges that plagued medieval childbirth, consistently revealing a profoundly painful and perilous event. Furthermore, the communal aspect of the birthing room, as discussed in Chapter 2, meant that while you had female support, you also had an audience for your suffering, your screams, your struggles, your moments of raw vulnerability were witnessed by your female relatives and neighbors. This lack of complete privacy, even in your most intimate moments, added another layer of psychological pressure, ensuring that your agony was a shared spectacle, reinforcing the collective fear and the stark realities of medieval childbirth. The psychological toll of enduring such a prolonged, agonizing, and terrifying physical ordeal would be immense. You would carry the memory of the searing pain, the desperate struggle, and the pervasive fear for your child's life and your own. This profound trauma, whether you survived or not, would be an indelible mark, shaping your future pregnancies if you had them, and your entire perception of your body and its vulnerabilities. Your triumph in bringing life into the world was often purchased at the cost of immense personal agony and enduring psychological scars. So, your medieval childbirth was defined by the labor itself, an agonizing, relentless ordeal of immense pain and terrifying complications. The brutal duration, the lack of effective pain medication, and the grim reality of obstructed births, all without modern medical intervention, pushed your body to its absolute breaking point. This profound physical and psychological torment, ensuring that the act of bringing life into the world was a constant, desperate battle against overwhelming odds, was a defining, profoundly awful and dangerous reality for a medieval woman. Even as you push through the agonizing throes of labor, your life as a medieval woman faced the most immediate and terrifying killer of all in childbirth: hemorrhage. Forget controlled blood loss. Excessive bleeding was a terrifyingly common reality, a rapid and often unstoppable descent into swift death, making your birthing experience profoundly awful and dangerous. Imagine the immense physical exertion of prolonged labor, your body racked with contractions. Then, as your child is finally born, or even before, a sudden, horrifying gush of blood, This is postpartum hemorrhage, a medical emergency in any era, but in the Middle Ages, it was a leading cause of maternal mortality, claiming countless lives with terrifying speed and brutal efficiency. It truly sucked to bleed to death after giving birth. The reasons for this terrifying prevalence were simple and deadly. Lack of understanding of uterine. Atony. After childbirth, the uterus normally contracts strongly to constrict the blood vessels that supplied the placenta, preventing excessive bleeding. However, if the uterus failed to contract adequately uterine atony, or if fragments of the placenta remained inside, profuse bleeding would occur. Midwives and attendants had no understanding of this physiological mechanism. They might try manual massage of the abdomen, but their ability to effectively stimulate uterine contraction was limited. No blood transfusions. If you lost a significant amount of blood, there was absolutely no way to replace it. The concept of blood types was unknown, and blood transfusions were centuries away. You would simply bleed out, your body rapidly weakening as vital blood flowed from you. No surgical intervention. If the bleeding was caused by a laceration in the birth canal that needed stitching, or if a retained placental fragment required removal. Midwives had no surgical tools or the knowledge to intervene safely. Any attempts at internal manipulation would be crude, dangerous, and likely worsen the bleeding or introduce infection. Weakened state. Your body was already severely weakened by the immense physical exertion of labor, prolonged pain, and often underlying malnutrition common in medieval peasants. This pre-existing exhaustion and vulnerability meant your body had little reserve to withstand a massive blood loss. You were already running on empty. Imagine the midwife's frantic efforts. She might try traditional remedies, applying poultices, chanting prayers, or pressing down on your abdomen. The other women in the room would be whispering, praying, their faces etched with fear as they watched your lifeblood drain onto the straw-covered floor. The quantity of blood would be terrifying, rapidly soaking through linens, a stark visual testament to your slipping life. Your body would grow cold, your vision would dim, and your consciousness would fade as you slipped into shock from the immense blood loss. It really sucked to literally see your life drain away. The speed of death from severe hemorrhage was horrifyingly swift. You could go from moments of relief after the child's birth to critical condition, to death. In a matter of minutes or a few hours, this rapid decline left little time for desperate remedies or last farewells, plunging the birthing room into sudden grief and despair. The triumph of bringing new life into the world would be immediately, tragically, overshadowed by your own rapid demise. The smell of fresh blood would be pervasive in the birthing room, mingling with the sweat, the dampness, and the underlying stench of unsanitary conditions. This sensory assault, combined with the visible horror of massive bleeding, would be deeply traumatic for all present, especially the midwife, who bore the immense responsibility of managing such a crisis with utterly inadequate tools. It really sucked to have your last cent be blood. One common misconception is that all medieval women were simply tough and survived childbirth easily due to a more natural lifestyle. In reality, postpartum hemorrhage was a leading cause of maternal mortality throughout the medieval period and well into the early modern era, claiming countless lives and leaving behind numerous orphaned children and widowed husbands. The lack of understanding of uterine atony and the inability to effectively stop profuse bleeding were critical factors in these high death rates. Accounts from medieval chronicles and medical texts frequently mention sudden, unexplained deaths of women shortly after childbirth, which modern historians attribute largely to hemorrhage and puerperal fever, which we will discuss in Chapter 6. Historians still meticulously study medieval medical texts, like those detailing birthing complications, demographic records, parish registers, noble family records showing maternal deaths, and osteoarchaeological evidence from female skeletal remains looking for signs of birth trauma and related complications to understand the precise prevalence and impact of hemorrhage on maternal mortality rates. Furthermore, the emotional toll on the surviving family would be immense. Your husband would be left with a newborn child, perhaps without a mother, facing the daunting task of raising a baby in a harsh world. Your other children would grow up without their mother, bearing the profound grief and the social stigma of a motherless household. The memory of your rapid decline, of your life bleeding away, would haunt them. A constant reminder of the fragility of life and the dangers inherent in childbirth. Your death was not just personal, it was a profound family catastrophe. The sheer powerlessness of the midwife in the face of profuse bleeding would be agonizing for her. She would witness lives draining away, her experience and traditional knowledge offering no effective solution. This constant confrontation with death, this inability to intervene effectively, would make every hemorrhage a profound personal failure, contributing to her own psychological burden and the grim reputation of childbirth. So, your medieval childbirth was profoundly awful and dangerous because it exposed you to the terrifying reality of hemorrhage, the rapid, often unstoppable, blood loss after childbirth, coupled with the complete lack of blood transfusions or surgical intervention, meant that excessive bleeding was a leading cause of maternal mortality, claiming countless lives with brutal efficiency. This swift, agonizing descent into death, transforming the joy of birth into profound tragedy, was a defining, profoundly miserable aspect of childbirth for a medieval woman. Even if you miraculously survived the agonizing labor and escaped the swift, terrifying fate of hemorrhage, your ordeal as a medieval woman in childbirth was far from over. A silent, insidious killer often lay in wait in the days and weeks following delivery puerperal fever. Forget clean recovery. The insidious threat of infection after childbirth, leading to agonizing and rapid death due to unsanitary practices, made your experience profoundly awful and dangerous. Imagine the first few days after giving birth. You've brought new life into the world, endured unimaginable pain, and perhaps even escaped near fatal blood loss. You might feel weak, exhausted, but a profound sense of relief washes over you. You are in your lying-in period, a traditional time of rest and confinement for the mother, often lasting for weeks, but lurking unseen is your deadliest adversary. It truly sucked to survive giving birth, only to get sick afterward. Puerperal fever, or childbed fever, was a terrifyingly common and lethal complication of childbirth in the Middle Ages and well into the early modern period. It was an infection of the reproductive organs, often the uterus, caused by bacteria introduced during labor or delivery, and the medieval world, lacking any understanding of germ theory, was a perfect breeding ground for it. Imagine the vectors of infection. Unsanitary birthing environment. Your birthing room, whether a humble cottage or a castle chamber, was far from sterile, as discussed in Chapter 2. The floor, the bedding, the water used for washing all could harbor bacteria from previous births, from human or animal waste, or from general daily life. Unwashed hands of attendants, the midwife and any assisting women family members. Neighbors would not wash their hands with antiseptic soap or sterilize their instruments. Their hands, carrying bacteria from other patients or from daily life, would directly contact your open womb during examinations or delivery. This was the primary mode of transmission for the deadly bacteria. Imagine the midwife. her hands seemingly clean, but unknowingly carrying invisible death into your body with every touch. It truly sucked to be cared for by invisible killers. Contaminated instruments. Any crude instruments used during a difficult birth for manual manipulation or, horrifyingly, fetal dismemberment would be unsterilized, directly introducing pathogens into the birth canal. Open wounds. Childbirth often resulted in lacerations or tears in the birth canal or perineum. These open wounds provided a direct pathway for bacteria to enter your bloodstream and spread rapidly to the uterus and other organs. Retained placental fragments. If small pieces of the placenta remained inside the uterus after delivery, they could quickly decompose, becoming a prime site for bacterial growth and infection. The onset of puerperal fever was typically insidious, appearing a few days or even up to a few weeks after delivery. You might initially develop a fever, followed by chills, severe abdominal pain, and a foul-smelling vaginal discharge. Imagine your body, already weakened by labor, racked by fever, your abdomen swelling and aching. As the infection rapidly consumed you from within, the pain would be agonizing, relentless, and distinct from the normal pains of postpartum recovery. The progression of puerperal fever was terrifyingly swift and agonizing. Without antibiotics centuries away, the infection would spread rapidly throughout your body, leading to sepsis, blood poisoning, peritonitis, inflammation of the abdominal lining, and eventually widespread organ failure. You would succumb to delirium, uncontrollable tremors, and profound physical deterioration, often dying within a matter of days or a couple of weeks, leaving behind your newborn child. Your triumph in giving life would be immediately, tragically, followed by your own agonizing death. It really sucked to literally rot to death after giving birth. Medieval medical knowledge was utterly helpless against puerperal fever, doctors if available. Mostly for the wealthy, and midwives had no understanding of its cause. They might attribute it to bad humors, divine displeasure, a cold in the womb, or a general wasting sickness. Their remedies bloodletting, which would further weaken you after blood loss in birth, purging, herbal concoctions, or superstitious rituals were completely ineffective and often hastened death by further debilitating your already weakened body. You would suffer and die without understanding why. Your family left in bewildered grief. The mortality rate from puerperal fever was astronomically high, making it a leading cause of maternal death throughout the Middle Ages. Its invisible nature, its rapid progression, and the lack of any effective treatment turned every postpartum period into a terrifying gamble with your life. Even if the birth itself seemed successful, the tragedy of a mother dying shortly after giving birth, leaving an orphaned infant, was a common occurrence, leaving profound emotional scars on families and communities. One common misconception is that maternal mortality in the Middle Ages was solely due to difficulties during labor itself. In reality, postpartum infections, particularly puerperal fever, were arguably the leading cause of maternal death in the days and weeks after childbirth. While difficult labors and hemorrhage, as discussed in Chapter 5, were significant, the pervasive lack of hygiene and germ theory made the postpartum period a particularly vulnerable time for new mothers. The phenomenon was so common that it was often referred to as childbed fever, reflecting its direct association with the birthing process. Historians still meticulously study medieval medical texts, including those discussing postpartum illnesses, hospital records when available, and detailed parish registers which often recorded deaths shortly after birth to understand the precise prevalence and impact of puerperal fever on maternal mortality rates, consistently confirming its devastating role. Furthermore, the emotional toll on the surviving family would be immense. Your husband would be left with a newborn child, perhaps without a mother's milk forcing reliance on wet nurses or animal milk, both risky and often with several other young children, facing the daunting task of raising a family in a harsh world without a crucial partner. Your children would grow up without their mother, bearing the profound grief and the social stigma of a motherless household, the memory of your rapid decline, of your agonizing death from a mysterious illness shortly after giving birth, would haunt them. A constant reminder of the fragility of life and the hidden dangers of childbirth. Your death was not just personal, it was a profound family catastrophe, ensuring a difficult future for those you left behind. The midwife's psychological burden would also be immense. She would constantly witness mothers succumbing to this mysterious, unstoppable fever, often powerless to intervene effectively. Despite her best efforts and her vast experience, she would see lives draining away, leading to profound professional frustration, grief, and perhaps even self-doubt. This continuous confrontation with death, often in women she had just helped deliver healthy babies, contributed to the grim reputation of childbirth and the limitations of her own knowledge. So, your medieval childbirth was profoundly awful and dangerous because it exposed you to the terrifying reality of puerperal fever, the insidious threat of infection after childbirth, caused by invisible bacteria and exacerbated by unsanitary birthing conditions, led to agonizing and rapid death for countless new mothers. This horrifying prevalence of this unseen killer, transforming the joy of birth into profound tragedy, was a defining, profoundly miserable aspect of childbirth for a medieval woman, ensuring that even if you survived labor, death might still lie in wait, even as your body suffered the agonizing postpartum period and battled the terrifying threat of puerperal fever. Your heart, as a medieval mother, was perpetually haunted by another, equally devastating reality, the newborn's peril. Forget innocent, healthy infants. The astronomically high rates of infant death made every new life a profound gamble, adding immense grief to the already dangerous process, and making childbirth profoundly awful and dangerous. Imagine the fragile new life you just brought into the world, after enduring unimaginable pain and risking your own life. A tiny, vulnerable baby lies in your arms, but your relief would be immediately tempered by a pervasive, chilling anxiety. The medieval world was a brutal place for newborns and infants, far more so than for adults. The statistical likelihood of your child surviving to adulthood was tragically low. The chances of them even surviving their first year were terrifyingly uncertain. It truly sucked to watch a baby fight for its life from day one. The mortality rates for infants and young children were astronomically high throughout the Middle Ages. Historians estimate that anywhere from 25% to 50% of all children would not survive their first year of life. Of those who survived infancy, many more would not reach the age of 5, and only a fraction would make it to adulthood around age 15-20. This meant that, for a medieval woman, experiencing the death of a child was not a rare tragedy. It was a common, heartbreaking reality, something you would likely endure multiple times in your reproductive life. You would know countless mothers in your village or social circle who had buried multiple children, their lives a tapestry of profound grief. The reasons for this horrifying infant mortality were manifold and deeply intertwined with the harsh realities of medieval life. Infectious diseases. This was the primary killer. Newborns and infants, with their underdeveloped immune systems, were incredibly vulnerable to a vast array of pathogens. Diseases like smallpox, measles, influenza, diphtheria, whooping cough, and various fevers would sweep through communities, often claiming children indiscriminately, cramped, unsanitary living conditions, whether in a peasant's cottage or a castle's great hall, contaminated water sources as discussed in earlier episodes, and lack of basic hygiene, no understanding of germ theory created ideal breeding grounds for contagion. Imagine your tiny baby racked by fever and coughing, their delicate body struggling to breathe, knowing there was no effective medicine to save them. Malnutrition. Even if you, the mother, survived childbirth and puerperal fever. The quality of infant nutrition was often precarious. If the mother died or was too ill to breastfeed and wet nurses were not always available or safe, infants might be fed animal milk or rudimentary gruels, which were often nutritionally inadequate or prone to contamination, leading to widespread infant malnutrition and increased susceptibility to disease. For weaning infants, access to soft, digestible, and nutritious foods was limited. Birth trauma, difficult or prolonged labors, as discussed in Chapter 4, could result in severe trauma to the newborn, including brain damage, broken bones, or internal injuries, leading to stillbirths or deaths shortly after birth. Midwives had limited ability to intervene safely in such cases. Exposure infants were vulnerable to the elements. Extreme cold in winter or excessive heat in summer could be fatal, especially in poorly insulated homes or during periods of famine when fuel was scarce. Accidents without modern safety measures. Infants and young children were susceptible to various accidents, falls, burns from open fires, or accidental suffocation in crowded beds overlaying. Lack of medical care. Pediatric medicine, as we know it, did not exist. Infants and children would receive basic care from midwives, wise women, or local healers, but their knowledge and remedies were often ineffective against serious illnesses. There were no vaccines, no antibiotics, no specialized treatments for childhood diseases. Your child's survival depended entirely on their innate resilience and immense luck. It truly sucked to be born when getting sick usually meant dying. The psychological toll on parents, particularly the mother, would be immense. You would love your children fiercely, but live with a pervasive, chilling dread for their survival. Every cough, every fever, every minor ailment would be a source of profound anxiety. The experience of repeatedly giving birth, enduring agonizing labor, only to watch your precious children succumb to unseen killers, would be soul-shattering. You would bear the profound grief of multiple losses, often bearing several children before one survived to adulthood. This was a continuous cycle of hope, love, loss, and renewed attempts, leading to profound emotional scarring. Imagine the sheer agony of burying 3, 4, or 5 of your own children, their tiny bodies cold in your arms, their lives tragically cut short. It truly sucked to live a life of constant grieving. The naming customs of the Middle Ages sometimes subtly reflected this high infant mortality. Some parents might delay naming a child until it survived its first few weeks or months, a grim acknowledgement of the low odds. The practice of giving children the names of deceased siblings was also common, highlighting both the continuity of the family line and the pervasive reality of infant loss. This unique detail underscores how deeply integrated child mortality was into the fabric of medieval life. One common misconception is that medieval parents were somehow less attached to their children due to high mortality rates, while cultural expressions of grief might have differed. And they adapted to the pervasive reality of loss. Archaeological findings like infant burials with cherished amulets and textual accounts like parents' laments in wills or chronicles clearly indicate profound parental love and grief for lost children. The very act of having numerous pregnancies and births, despite the immense dangers, also speaks to the deep desire for offspring. historians still meticulously study medieval demographic records parish registers, family genealogies, mortality bills, archaeological findings from child burials, and medieval literary personal accounts to understand the precise rates of infant mortality, the specific causes of death, and the profound emotional impact on families, consistently revealing deep parental grief in the face of such overwhelming loss. Furthermore, the very concept of childhood was often brief and harsh. Children were expected to contribute to household labor from a young age. If they survived, their education was largely practical, preparing them for a life of toil. The precious, innocent period of early childhood, as we understand it today, was often cut short by the demands of survival and the grim reality of high mortality, ensuring that only the hardiest or luckiest would make it to adulthood. The social fabric of the community was also shaped by infant mortality. The constant cycle of birth and death meant that families were always in a state of flux. Communities would witness widespread loss, and the collective grief would be a constant background to daily life. While support systems existed, the scale of the tragedy often overwhelmed communal resources, leaving families to grapple with their losses largely on their own. So, your experience of medieval childbirth was profoundly awful and dangerous because it meant confronting the newborn's peril, the astronomically high rates of infant and child death caused by rampant infectious diseases, malnutrition, birth trauma, and primitive medical care ensured that every new life was a profound gamble. This devastating reality, bringing immense grief and repeated heartbreak to parents, was a defining, profoundly miserable aspect of childbirth for a medieval woman, ensuring that the act of giving life was perpetually shadowed by the chilling specter of early death. Even as your heart ached with the profound grief of infant loss and your body struggled with the aftermath of childbirth, your desperate hope for a safe delivery often led you to embrace bizarre and unsettling practices. Forget evidence-based medicine. You would resort to superstitions and charms, employing a bewildering array of desperate, often futile, folk remedies and magical rituals believed to aid childbirth, making this period profoundly awful and dangerous. Imagine the pervasive anxiety that filled your birthing room. The pain of labor was immense, the duration unpredictable, and the threat of death for you and your child was omnipresent. In a world without modern medical understanding or effective interventions, people desperately turned to anything that offered a glimmer of hope or a sense of control over an uncontrollable process. This profound helplessness fueled a vast array of superstitious beliefs and magical practices. Often passed down through generations of women and midwives, it truly sucked to rely on magic for your life. Your midwife, or the older women assisting you, would employ numerous folk remedies and rituals believed to ease labor, ward off evil spirits, or ensure a healthy birth. These practices varied widely by region, local custom, and the specific beliefs of the community, but often included amulets and charms. You might be given various objects to hold, wear, or place in the birthing room. This could be a piece of consecrated bread, a religious relic like a fragment of a saint's bone or cloth, specific herbs, vervain, hyssop, or inscribed parchments with magical symbols or prayers. These were believed to possess protective powers, to ward off demons who might try to steal the baby, or to magically open the birth canal. Imagine clutching a small, worn charm, desperately hoping it would somehow prevent you from bleeding to death. Symbolic actions. Specific actions would be performed in the birthing room, all knots in the house in clothing, ropes, or hair might be untied to symbolically untie the birth process and ensure an easy delivery. Doors, windows, and chests might be open to help the baby emerge. You might be given objects believed to embody strength or fertility to grasp. These actions, while offering psychological comfort, had no physiological effect on labor. It really sucked to rely on unknotting things to give birth. Magical invocations and prayers. Midwives and attendants would constantly utter prayers to saints like Saint Margaret, patron saint of childbirth, or the Virgin Mary, or recite ancient folk charms and incantations. These were desperate pleas to divine or supernatural forces for intervention, seeking a miracle where human aid failed. The repetition of these words, the fervent belief, might offer a psychological sense of control, but they couldn't stop a hemorrhage or correct a breech presentation. Ritualistic cleansing beyond basic washing. Specific ritual cleansing with consecrated water or herbal concoctions might be performed to purify the birthing space and the mother, believed to ward off malevolent influences or to ensure the baby's spiritual purity. Consuming bizarre concoctions. You might be given various medicinal drinks or poultices believed to speed up labor or alleviate pain. These often involved strange mixtures of herbs, animal parts, e.g., powdered animal horn or dried excrement, as explored in a previous episode about medical cures on the Silk Road, or even ground minerals. Their efficacy was entirely unproven, and some concoctions could be dangerous, inducing vomiting, diarrhea, or even poisoning, further debilitating your already weakened body. Imagine forcing down a foul-tasting, gritty liquid, desperately hoping it would help, but fearing it might make you sicker. It really sucked to drink weird potions, relics, and holy water. Holy water, blessed by a priest, might be sprinkled around the room or given to you to drink. Relics of saints, or even fragments of holy texts, might be placed near you or under your bed, believed to invoke divine protection and intercession for a safe delivery. This blend of Christian piety and older folk magic was common, reflecting a desperate, eclectic search for spiritual aid. The pervasive nature of these superstitions underscored the profound helplessness felt by medieval women and their attendants in the face of childbirth. With no understanding of modern medical science, every complication, every prolonged labor, and every tragic death was often attributed to supernatural forces, evil spirits, curses, divine displeasure for sins, or witchcraft. This fatalistic worldview, while sometimes offering spiritual solace, also meant that effective scientific interventions were not sought, prolonging suffering and contributing to high mortality rates. The psychological impact of these rituals was a double-edged sword. On one hand, they could provide a sense of comfort, hope, and control to the terrified mother and her family, the belief that God or protective spirits were intervening, or that specific actions could influence the outcome, could reduce anxiety and provide a sense of shared purpose. On the other hand, if the rituals failed, or if the charms proved ineffective, the ensuing tragedy could lead to immense guilt, spiritual despair, and even accusations of witchcraft against the midwife or the mother herself. Further exacerbating their misery, it really sucked when your only hope failed. One common misconception is that medieval people relied exclusively on rational, scientific medicine, or exclusively on superstition. In reality, medieval medical practice was a complex blend of empirical observation, traditional folk remedies, astrological beliefs, and religious ritual. Midwives, while skilled practically, often incorporated all these elements into their care, reflecting the prevailing worldview that illness and health were influenced by both physical and spiritual forces. The reliance on charms and superstitions was not necessarily a sign of ignorance, but a desperate pragmatic attempt to find any means of control in a world where so much was uncontrollable. Historians still meticulously study medieval charm books, liturgical texts like prayers for childbirth, and medical manuscripts to understand the precise blend of medical and magical practices used in childbirth, often revealing a highly integrated system where the spiritual and practical were not distinct. Furthermore, the involvement of the church and religious figures in these rituals highlighted the profound moral and spiritual dimension of childbirth. It was seen as a struggle against the curse of Eve, a moment where the soul was at peril. This meant that spiritual interventions were not just optional, they were essential for ensuring both earthly survival and eternal salvation. Adding another layer of pervasive pressure to the already intense physical and emotional ordeal, the cost of some of these charms or specialized remedies, even if not directly financial, could be immense. Perhaps a valuable family heirloom had to be offered to a shrine, or a significant amount of a rare herb painstakingly collected. This added an economic burden to the desperate search for relief, ensuring that even your attempts at salvation came at a cost. The communal aspect of the birthing room, as discussed in Chapter 2, meant that these superstitions were widely shared and reinforced. The collective belief in certain charms or rituals would create a powerful atmosphere of shared hope and fear, binding the women together in their desperate attempts to influence an unpredictable outcome. This shared experience, however, also meant that any failure of the charms would be collectively witnessed, reinforcing a pervasive sense of helplessness. So, your medieval childbirth was profoundly awful and dangerous because it forced you to rely on superstitions and charms, the use of bizarre, often futile, folk remedies and magical rituals intended to aid delivery and ward off evil, underscored the profound helplessness people felt in the face of immense pain and high mortality rates. This desperate reliance on unproven practices, making every spiritual intervention a gamble, was a defining, profoundly miserable aspect of childbirth for a medieval woman. Even as your spirit wrestled with the profound grief of infant loss, and your hopes flickered with desperate superstitions, your body, having endured the agony of labor, faced the brutal reality of the aftermath. Forget quick recovery. The prolonged, painful healing process and the grim certainty of future dangerous pregnancies made childbirth a recurring nightmare, making it profoundly awful and dangerous. Imagine the days and weeks following your delivery. You brought new life into the world, perhaps survived a hemorrhage or escaped puerperal fever, but your body is far from whole. You would be confined to your bed for a period known as lying in, typically lasting several weeks to a month. Depending on your social status and the severity of the birth, this wasn't a time of pampered rest. It was a period of intense discomfort and precarious recovery. It truly sucked to be bedridden after giving birth. Your body would be a landscape of pain and physical trauma, perineal tears and lacerations. Childbirth almost inevitably resulted in tears in the perineum, the area between the vagina and anus, or other lacerations in the birth canal. Without modern surgical repair, these tears would heal slowly, if at all, often leaving gaping wounds susceptible to infection, causing chronic pain, and sometimes leading to incontinence, involuntary loss of bladder or bowel control. Imagine living with constant pain and the profound indignity of uncontrolled bodily functions, a permanent scar from your delivery, bruising and swelling your entire pelvic area, perineum, and inner thighs would be severely bruised and swollen from the immense pressure and physical exertion of labor. Movement would be agonizing, making even simple acts like sitting, walking, or urinating incredibly painful. After pains. The uterus would continue to contract after birth, causing cramps known as afterpains. As it slowly returned to its pre-pregnancy size, these pains, while normal, would add to your overall discomfort, breast engorgement, and mastitis. If you were breastfeeding, your breasts would become engorged with milk, often painfully swollen and tender. Lack of proper hygiene or incomplete emptying could lead to mastitis, a painful infection of the breast tissue, causing fever, chills, and severe localized pain. Without antibiotics, this could lead to abscesses and systemic illness. Imagine the agony of a raging fever and swollen, infected breasts, all while trying to feed a newborn. It really sucked to literally hurt from feeding your baby. Fatigue and weakness. Your body would be profoundly exhausted from the immense physical exertion of labor and delivery, coupled with potential blood loss and inadequate nutrition. You would feel perpetually weak, your muscles aching, your energy depleted, making recovery a slow, arduous process. This exhaustion, combined with the constant demands of a newborn, would make restful sleep elusive. The lack of modern pain management beyond rudimentary herbal remedies meant you endured this prolonged physical discomfort largely unmedicated. The midwife or other female attendants would offer traditional remedies, perhaps warm compresses, herbal poultices, or simple prayers, but their ability to truly alleviate your pain or speed your healing was limited. You were expected to endure, to suffer in silence, relying solely on your body's innate resilience. Infection remained a terrifying threat as discussed in Chapter 6 concerning puerperal fever, your unhealed tears and lacerations, exposed to the unsanitary environment of the birthing room and the unwashed hands of attendants, where direct pathways for deadly bacteria, even after the immediate danger of puerperal fever seemed to pass. Slower onset infections could arise, leading to chronic pain, abscesses, or even later complications that affected future pregnancies. Your postpartum recovery was a precarious battle against unseen killers. The psychological toll of this painful aftermath would be immense. You would grapple with profound fatigue, physical discomfort, and the emotional complexities of new motherhood, often compounded by grief if previous children had died. The constant pain, the slow healing, and the knowledge of the dangers you had just survived would leave indelible scars on your psyche. You might suffer from what we now recognize as postpartum depression, but in medieval times, this would be largely unacknowledged, leaving you to grapple with profound emotional distress in silence, perhaps attributing it to spiritual failings. It truly sucked to be emotionally broken, with no one to truly understand why, and then the grim certainty of repeat performance. For most medieval women, the act of childbirth was not a singular event, it was a recurring reality. The high infant mortality rates, as discussed in Chapter 7, meant that women were expected, and compelled by necessity and societal pressure, to have numerous pregnancies throughout their fertile years in order to ensure that at least a few children survived to adulthood. Imagine recovering from one agonizing, life-threatening delivery, only to face the chilling certainty that you would endure it all again and again for years to come. Each subsequent pregnancy would bring renewed dread, a fresh gamble with your life and the lives of your unborn children. This relentless cycle of pain, risk, and profound personal sacrifice was an inescapable aspect of your existence. It really sucked to face death over and over for your family, The social context often pushed for these repeat pregnancies. Your husband, your lord, and your community relied on you to produce heirs, especially sons. Family planning, or limiting pregnancies, was virtually non-existent, driven by necessity and societal expectations rather than personal choice. Your body was a vessel for lineage, and its immense suffering was largely unacknowledged as a private matter, subsumed by the greater good of family and community continuity. One common misconception is that medieval women bounced back quickly from childbirth due to their hardiness. In reality, medieval medical texts, while rudimentary, and archaeological findings of female skeletal remains provide ample evidence of the long, painful, and often incomplete recovery process after childbirth. Pelvic injuries, infections, and chronic pain from birth trauma were common, often leading to lifelong disabilities or complications in subsequent pregnancies. The lying-in period, while offering some rest, was often insufficient for a full recovery from such immense trauma. Historians still meticulously study medieval medical treatises like De Passionibus Mulierum by Trotula, or various midwifery manuals detailing postpartum care, and paleopathological analyses of female skeletons looking for signs of birth canal trauma, pubic symphysis separation, or postpartum infections to understand the precise nature and long-term consequences of childbirth injuries and their impact on women's health and subsequent pregnancies. Furthermore, the lack of effective contraception or family planning methods meant that women were often perpetually pregnant or recovering from pregnancy throughout their fertile years. This continuous cycle of conception, gestation, labor, and recovery, often shortened by the need to return to labor in the fields, placed an immense cumulative strain on their bodies, accelerating their physical decay and increasing their risk of death with each subsequent pregnancy. Your body was a factory, constantly producing, constantly breaking down. The very cultural narrative around childbirth, often tied to the biblical curse on Eve, reinforced the idea of suffering as inevitable and even righteous. This religious fatalism, while offering spiritual context, also meant that the immense pain and physical decay were simply accepted as part of a woman's lot, rather than a medical problem to be solved. This pervasive societal and religious acceptance of suffering contributed to the lack of advancement in maternal care, perpetuating the brutal reality for generations. So, your experience of medieval childbirth was profoundly awful and dangerous because its aftermath involved a prolonged, painful healing process, often complicated by chronic injuries and infections. This physical agony, coupled with the immense grief of infant loss and the chilling certainty of facing numerous future dangerous pregnancies, transformed your existence into a recurring nightmare. This relentless cycle of suffering, demanding your body's constant repeat performance, was a defining, profoundly miserable aspect of childbirth for a medieval woman, ensuring that the act of giving life was perpetually shadowed by pain, loss, and the grim specter of future perils. You've endured the terrifying pregnant pause, faced the dark reality of the birthing room, relied on the skilled, yet grimly limited, midwife, pushed through the agonizing pain and deadly complications of labor itself, escaped the swift, terrifying fate of hemorrhage, battled the insidious, unseen killer of puerperal fever, and grieved the heartbreaking reality of your newborn's peril. Finally, you navigated desperate superstitions and suffered the prolonged agony of postpartum recovery, only to face the grim certainty of future dangerous pregnancies. As the phantom cries of labor fade and the imagined chill of the birthing room finally dissipates, a profound, lingering truth settles upon you. Childbirth for a medieval woman was not merely a natural process, it was an awful and dangerous reality. A brutal lottery for life itself, a relentless cycle of pain, peril, and profound personal sacrifice that utterly defined your existence. Consider the unyielding physical brutality that defined your reproductive life. Every pregnancy was a high-stakes gamble, every labor an agonizing ordeal without effective pain relief. You faced terrifying complications, hemorrhage, obstructed labor, eclampsia, which, without modern medical intervention, often led to swift, excruciating death. Your body was a constant battlefield, pushed to its absolute limits, enduring immense pain and systemic breakdown, leaving you with lasting physical trauma and the grim certainty of future repeat performances. Your very survival through birth was a testament to extreme endurance, not comfort. It truly sucked to be born a woman in medieval times. Then there's the pervasive, unseen menace of disease, the unsanitary conditions of the birthing room, the lack of germ theory, and the unwashed hands of attendants turned the sacred act of birth into a terrifying pathway for deadly infections like puerperal fever. These invisible killers often claimed mothers days or weeks after delivery, turning the joy of new life into profound tragedy. Infants, too, faced horrifying mortality rates, succumbing to rampant infectious diseases that you were powerless to prevent. Your body was a constant target for pathogens, and your triumph in giving life was perpetually overshadowed by the specter of death for both yourself and your child. And what about the crushing emotional and psychological toll? You lived with perpetual anxiety, the profound dread of losing your own life or burying multiple children, the agony of labor, the terrifying complications, and the heartbreaking reality of infant death left indelible scars on your psyche, leading to profound grief, despair, and often unacknowledged postpartum depression. Your maternal instincts were constantly tested by loss, and your spiritual beliefs often provided little more than a framework for enduring suffering rather than truly preventing it. Your existence was a continuous cycle of hope, love, loss, and renewed attempts, shaping your emotional landscape into a tapestry of profound sorrow. Finally, the lack of control and the unyielding societal pressure. Your body was a vessel for lineage, not entirely your own. Societal expectations and the absence of effective family planning meant you were often compelled to endure numerous pregnancies throughout your fertile years, further increasing your cumulative risk of death. You were at the mercy of primitive medical knowledge, relying on midwives with limited tools and on desperate superstitions and charms that rarely offered true efficacy. Your personal pain was often unacknowledged, subsumed by the greater good of family continuity and the grim reality of a world where human life was abundant. But individual survival was precarious. It truly sucked to have so little control over your own body and destiny. The overall impact of childbirth on medieval women was immense, profoundly shaping their lives, their health, and their mortality rates. It was a defining aspect of female experience, a brutal rite of passage that few escaped unscathed, and many did not survive at all. The very concept of motherhood in the Middle Ages was inextricably linked to immense physical danger and profound grief. Far removed from the idealized images of today, one particularly poignant and often overlooked detail is the practice of making wills or final confessions during labor. Due to the extreme danger of childbirth, many medieval women, if they had the means, would make arrangements for their property or even confess their sins before or during severe labor, acknowledging the very real possibility that they might not survive. This grim practice highlights the universal understanding of childbirth as a perilous, often fatal, event, a moment of profound confrontation with one's own mortality. It underscores the pervasive fear that every medieval woman faced when her time came, transforming the birthing bed into a final, solemn stage where she might prepare for death even as she strove to bring forth life. Historians still meticulously study these wills, confessional manuals, and religious texts like prayers for women in childbirth to understand the precise psychological and spiritual preparations women undertook for labor. Confirming the widespread awareness of its life-threatening nature, ultimately, your experience of the awful and dangerous reality of childbirth for a medieval woman was a defining, profound, and continuous ordeal. It was a brutal lottery for life itself, where every pregnancy was a high-stakes gamble, every labor an agony, and every new life entered a world of immense peril. This relentless cycle of pain, risk, and profound personal sacrifice was a testament to human endurance, but it was a life lived perpetually under the shadow of death, ensuring that the act of bringing life into the world was perpetually overshadowed by its inherent, terrifying dangers. As you now drift into a deep, comforting sleep, let the distant whispers of medieval birthing rooms and the imagined ache of a body in labor finally subside. You are safe, in your own time, far removed from the brutal realities of childbirth in the past. May your dreams be peaceful, filled with the quiet certainty of modern medicine, compassionate care, and the profound comfort of a world where bringing new life is celebrated without such terrifying peril. A stark contrast to the awful and dangerous truth we've explored tonight. And now, good night, and have sweet dreams.